Well, it's time to play Did We Lose Everything Since Last Time? Because I was just recording the next episode when suddenly FL Studio crashed in a way I've never seen it crash before. So it's time to check up the backups folder. Get FL Studio look, but if you go on plus...
The vegetable man.
Yes, this is a good time to bring this up. Yeah, there's this backups folder here. It will save backups of the stuff that you've been working on. Well, we lost everything. Well, maybe not everything. I don't remember when the last time I saved it was, so... Yep, we are back to square one. Well, let's just pretend that melody episode didn't happen. So, I'll just have to try and remake that melody between the next episode. Luckily, you don't need the melody right now for this episode, because we're just going to get into sound design now first. So, actually... I just did a bunch of things I should actually just explain. So, as you can see, if you right click here, you can get rid of stuff. I think I already said that last time, but just wanted to clear that up. So I got rid of those drums that we put in for a second earlier in the first episode. And second, when you click on this patterns thing, you can switch between what you've already done. So these were the drums that we made earlier. In fact, I can delete this by deleting this here. This is how you can switch between patterns. You can also switch between which ones you're going to place on, on this little drop down thing, thingy. So to create a new pattern, well technically you can drag this and just go to a pattern that isn't used, but easiest way to do it, pardon me, is go on patterns and there's a few options here. All three of these essentially will just get you another pattern that isn't used yet, a brand new pattern. I tend to just use find next empty no naming because you can name your patterns, but I don't really care to. You can also go rename and color to rename your patterns, and also make sure that when a pattern is placed in here, it gets a color. Now, this is actually where it crashed earlier. I don't know why, but clicking more colors, and this has never happened to me before, just crashed FL Studio. It just infinitely loaded, and I had to task manager to close it. It was... I don't know. In fact, if I don't mind if I lose it now, because I mean I can just load it back up. What happens if I try it again? It works instantly. What? I haven't. Yeah, earlier I just clicked that button and it literally FL Studio could not respond. It could not even close. It couldn't even realize it wasn't responding. I had to task manager and stop it. That is weird. Well, anyway, yeah, you can select your color here. You may notice as well that a lot of these options are grayed out. Well, you know, not as in that you can't select them, but they look dark and not very vibrant. I personally don't like this, but basically the idea is that here it's all grey, so the default colours they give you are all grey. I don't know why there's the same kind of set of colours repeated 5 times. These are your recent colours, and yeah, if you select a much brighter colour from here, that will not appear greyed out, so you know, if you want it to be bright red you can. Anyway, well, that's too important. It's kind of annoying that I lost all of it just because I was talking about that one isn't even really important. So anyway, getting back to all this, we're going to copy paste this by using the box tool and just selecting everything, Control C to copy it, new pattern, and if we go into add, we can add a new synth here. Now, I think I'm going to start with 3 times oscillator. This is the most simple synth in FL Studio, and there we go, Control V to paste, and we have our thing in here. Just gonna go into pattern so that it's playing what's in here and not what's in there. So, if you didn't know, you can also play your keyboard on your computer like a keyboard, a musical keyboard. For instance, if I press Q on my keyboard now, that's C sharp. If I press Q, that's C, W, D. You kind of get the point. So yeah, with that you can kind of test out synths. So this right here, I'm going to quickly make some changes. This is what it looks like when you make have it open up like by default, but technically the most basic way this could be is to turn these off and switch this to 12, which I'm pretty sure is supposed to be its normal pitch. Oh no. Oh no, that's supposed to be... Okay, never mind, 24 is fine. So here we have a sine wave. It's not super pleasant to listen to on for an extended period of time. But it is thingy. It is basically the most basic form of sound. Now, if you wonder what I mean by that, I will get back to that, but it won't be important until we talk about additive synthesis, which is the next part, so, you know, don't worry so much about that. But basically, there are a certain amount of sound waves in subtractive synthesizers, which are the ones we're talking about right now, which are essentially... you'll see them in almost every synthesizer, even non-subtractive, honestly. So this is a sine wave, this is one of them. There's then the triangle wave, which is a little bit more going on in it. There's the square wave. And finally, the most complex, the saw wave. So you can definitely tell that, you know, that one's kind of the one with the most going on in it, and I'll explain that later. Then there are 3 more here. In fact, technically... Okay, that is... Yeah, okay. I was pretty sure that wasn't a sound wave. There are 3 more here. These ones aren't as important, but I will still tell you about them. There's a rounded saw, which... Yeah, I don't really know. It just sounds like that. I don't really know the significance of it. There's random, which I'm pretty sure is just white noise. Yeah, essentially, this is just all the frequencies. Oh yeah, speaking of which, I just thought I'd quickly add, you know, the sine wave. I believe middle C is 500 hertz, so this right here, that should be 500 hertz. Now, every single time it goes up an octave, that's thingy. That's double the frequency. So that means that C6 should be 1 kilohertz, and a 1 kilohertz sine wave is the sound that beeps out swearing. So that, unless I'm wrong, this is off the top of my head. I don't remember the frequencies of most notes off the top of my head, but. I believe this is a 1 kilohertz sine wave, and that will be used to bleep people out when they're swearing. This last option, I believe, is to import a wave file. Like, you can save a wave shape like this as a file, and then import it through this. I'm not gonna lie, I don't know how to do that, so I haven't really used this option. So anyway, you might notice this is repeated 3 times. These 2 will also make sound, except for this mix level right here is the amount of volume they're allowed to make, and we turned this down to 0 earlier. If we turn this up to 50% on the second one, we now have 2 sine waves playing. So you can kind of tell the sound waves change. As you can tell, when you turn this to 100, it means that the first one's completely gone. And you can have this divided by up to 3 of these oscillators. There's then stereo phase offset. Oh boy, what's that do? So, phase is one of those things that it sounds like such a sciencey word and all that. It probably scares you a little bit, but it's not too bad in most cases. Essentially, what phase kind of means is... it kind of means a delay. So, essentially, if you have 2 sounds play at the same time, and they sound very similar, but there's a very slight difference, and one of the most common differences is when they start playing, there could be a millisecond delay between the 2. It can have weird and interesting effects on your sound. So, what this stereo phase offset means, essentially, if I remember right, is that the time at which this sound will start playing will be different for the left and right ears, and it will either be further back or further ahead depending on when you move up or down. I believe that's it. I haven't used this too much, it's not that important, so don't worry too much if you don't get it. There's then stereo detune, which is essentially the same concept but with pitch instead of phase. This coarse pitch thing, essentially what this means is every 12 of these, because this is notes, is a scale. So I can move this down 2 scales or up 2 scales. And if I move it just up 1 notch, that's moving up a note in pitch. It says semitones. Semitones is just another name for a note, because for some reason a tone is 2 notes, not 1 note. Yeah, I don't know what's up with that. And this fine knob here, as you can see, it's adding cents. And what it means by that is cent tones. So this is 1/100th of the pitch gap between one note and another note. So if I turn this up to 100, that is now moving the pitch up by 1 note. But if I move it there, it's moving it to about half a note, and you can move it up and down like that. And then there's just panning to the left or right ear. So this is what you can do with this. Stereo phase randomness. Oh, I didn't even notice they added this thing too. I'm not going to talk about these two things because they're not too important, but this is actually quite interesting. I might get back to that later. So you got the important stuff about this. So now we've talked about 3 times oscillator. We're actually going to get into the subtractive synthesizer we're actually going to be using, which is GMS. And I loved this synthesizer back when I was first starting out. I don't really use it anymore, and I actually kind of regret that because I do feel nostalgic for this. I made so many presets for this. Not that they were necessarily super good or anything. Wait, where's default? There it is. Well, some of them were good. I like this one. Anyway, sorry, I'm messing around too much. Wait, was it backwards? It was backwards, okay. So, sorry, I just did some things. So when you click on this program thing, it will open this menu. This is a bunch of pre-made stuff. When you go into user, default should be the only one here, because all this stuff here is stuff that I've made and saved in here. But if you go on default, you will get just saw waves. Let's turn this up a bit. Still a bit quiet, but we'll get to that later. So essentially, the sound starts here. At the moment, the only one making any sound is this one oscillator. If we want the second one to have sound, we turn up this knob, and the third one this knob. So this is the first part that's important. We can select a bunch of waveforms from here, and again we can load a waveform from the file. Most of these, I actually don't even know what they look like. You can just try them out, see how they sound, see if you like them. But of course there are some recognizable ones. We've got the saw wave here, we've got the square wave here, we've got the triangle, we have the sine. So those are kind of the holy quadrilogy of waveforms that are basically in everything. So yeah, we're going to have just a saw to start with. Over here, as I said, is the mix part where you can say, hey, I want oscillator 2 to also be heard, and oscillator 3. And noise is just white noise, so this is what white noise sounds like. So yeah, if you want it, you'd be surprised, there are actually quite a lot of people who use it. I personally struggle, I don't like using it, but apparently it's a good idea. Anyway, so then there's this modulation section down here, which is kind of weird. Well, to start with, there are 3 options for modulation. The one sync option is kind of a rare thing, to be honest. I don't see it too much, but it's an interesting way of doing it. So if I start playing this, and I start changing this, so that sounds a bit weird, but what's even weirder about this is if I just leave this as exactly 50%. That sounds very similar, doesn't it? What if I put it to 100%? Well, I mean, it's harsh on the ears because it's really high pitched, but it doesn't sound like there's too much crazy stuff going on. But if I have it like here, actually, it doesn't sound that weird. I was expecting it to sound weirder than that. Thingy, I suppose it's maybe just because there's loads of notes being played at once. I don't know. Okay, this is a better example with one note. So, and sound like the same waveform, don't they? Even though they're different pitches. But this sounds a bit different. It doesn't quite sound like the same waveform. Now, the weird thing that's going on here is as you might have picked up by now, when this is at 50% and when this is at 100%, this right here, this is it. This is the same sound but with 2 octaves up, and this is the same sound but 1 octave up. And this always confused me. I thought, well, how does that work? How does it not sound weird that I'm moving the pitch if this is just affecting pitch? Because if this is just affecting pitch, if you click on this little gear thing here, you can get rid of or make this menu appear. And every single synth, you can do this with an FL Studio, unless it's a third-party synth, in which case it depends. But you have this pitch slider, and if I set the range to 12, an octave, this is essentially what it should sound like when I move that one sync thing if it's just affecting pitch. In fact, 24, because this goes up 2 octaves. Which obviously sounds a whole lot more awful. So I was very confused what was going on here, and essentially what it is can I play like a super low note to demonstrate this, or... In fact, can I get rid of some of this stuff right now? Okay, I don't know. There should be a way to get rid of some of this stuff. What I just wanted to do is I wanted to make this thing appear longer so it was easy to see. But I guess I might just have to pass on that. Okay, so you can kind of see this is where the saw wave kind of ends here. If I turn up the 1 sync modulation, this seems like the same thing but just 2 octaves up. As you can see, there are 4 saw waves for every one there was before. And if I set this to 50%, there's 2 saw waves for every one there was before. But here there's still 2 saw waves for every one there was before by the looks of things, but they seem to be spaced apart differently, which probably seems a little weird. In fact, I haven't done this before in a long time, but I think it's time to open Paint. Don't know what that was. Thingy. So essentially, usually when you increase pitch, all that you're doing is making it so that from left to right, a wave, takes less space in terms of what you're doing on the graph. Obviously, technically, what you're doing is that you make it so it makes that wave shape more times a second. But obviously, since the left side and the right side of that graph, that horizontal axis is all time. It means that obviously if you reduce the amount of time that it takes to do one, then you're kind of making it shorter. So with my terrible, terrible paint skills, we're going to draw something here. So essentially with pitch, it would turn, yeah, that's great, to probably something like that if we if we made it like, I don't know, 1.5 times higher pitch but not quite a whole octave up. Whereas with 1 sync modulation, it does a weird thing. It would take this, and the reason why it almost sounds like it's changing pitch but it isn't quite is because it would take this and it would start to do the same thing as before, but then when this finishes its oscillation, sorry, you just have to think about that for a second. I thought I got it wrong for a second, but I didn't. Sorry, I just kind of need to extend this. So I forgot to include a part of my model. Let's say that the oscillation is supposed to finish here. Like, say this part it would be here, but we're going to cut it off. With 1 sync modulation, it would get to this point, and instead of carrying on as if this point wasn't here, it will do this again. And of course this is different because with this we have the same shape, it's just, not fitting into this box, so to speak. But here we actually have a completely different shape because it's that, as opposed to this is technically just this shape repeated twice. As you can see, these are 2 different shapes. So essentially what we're doing with 1 sync modulation is we're changing the shape of the wave rather than the pitch of the wave. And it just so happens that if it can fit perfectly within this box, then the shape doesn't change, which is why it sounds like the same sound just pitched up. Because technically it is, if you put it exactly 50% or exactly 100%. Because at exactly 50%, it's gone 1 octave up, and at exactly 100%, it's gone 2 octaves up. So yeah, that's a little bit confusing. I don't want you to be too scared if you didn't understand that, because to be honest, this isn't super necessary. I'm mainly kind of teaching you this so that you know, you just, if you did get it, it can make you feel more confident knowing how everything works in this thing. So anyway, so there's one sync modulation. Then there's 2-to-1 FM, which is interesting. So these 2-to-1 ones all use modulator 1 as a carrier and modulator 2 as a modulator. So essentially, sorry, modulator 1 and 2. This is wave shape 1 and wave shape 2. It uses the second one as a modulator and the first one as a carrier. What that basically means is that you can't hear the second one unless we turn it on here, but I wouldn't recommend that. We can't hear the second one, but the second one still has an effect on the first one. So, if we turn this up, probably best to demonstrate it with sine waves. If I turn it down to start. So we have a sine wave playing right now. Because a sine wave is a very kind of low sound, again we'll get to that with additive synthesis, you probably can't hear it unless you've got good headphones on, but we're playing a sine wave right now, as you can see by this, a very low sine wave. Now, we have wave shape 2 as a sine wave too. So if we turn up this FM, we will FM modulate that sine wave by another sine wave. Now, as you can see, this has an interesting effect on the sine wave shape. Now this is called frequency modulation for a reason. In fact, I'm going to do something quick. Don't worry about what I'm doing. It's just going to be to make this easier for you to see. We'll get to this later. So this right here is just basically a bigger, easier to see version of what's up there. Can I make it... Okay, extend it out like that. So yeah, okay. If you look at this, this actually might be a little bit too high pitched. I might want to move it down a bit. Nah, that's too low pitched. Let's try G. Yeah, that's good. So, as you can see, we have these bits where the sine wave is really the sine waves are really closely grouped together. They've got very high frequencies. And then these bits where it's the opposite. There's one really long and like drudging kind of sine wave before it speeds up again. So essentially, what's going on here is that they're taking the value that this sine wave represents and using it to kind of quote unquote multiply the frequency of the carrier. So basically, when you see a wave on a graph like this, when it comes to sound, you usually think that's the volume. And it is, usually, on the kind of your end of things if you're just listening to it, but it doesn't have to just mean volume. You can technically have that, you got to remember that computers just use data, basically, and the only reason they can do anything except just hold data is because they have stuff like speakers and all that output it to us, and lights, obviously, for the screen. So, until we take it as an output to put out the speakers, all this is information. And all that this information is at what point in time is this value at what. So obviously when it's above it's a positive, and when it's below it's a negative, and when it's here it's 0. So what this kind of does is, when the sine wave here has its line on this middle part, then the pitch of the original sine wave, the carrier sine wave, will be the same as always. But once this moves up, once the wave for this reaches at the top or the bottom, at that point it will vastly increase the frequency of this. In fact, can I make the modulator lower pitch? Would that be a good idea? Well, anyway, yeah, I don't think there's a better way I can put that. It sounds a bit complicated. Again, don't worry if you don't understand it all. You can kind of get a feel for it and come back to this later. Then there's RM modulation. Now, what this does objectively I could tell you, but I think it will not be very intuitive to you. The simplest way I can put this is it combines two sound waves. It essentially outputs what it would look like if you took the average amplitude, which is basically how high up or down it is, for both sound waves for an oscillation. That's essentially what RM modulation will do. What's interesting is you can have an RM modulator whose pitch doesn't perfectly match with the carrier, and that will have a very interesting effect. I could explain this effect, but I think it'd be confusing without a visual aid. I'll probably do a talk about it in more depth later. But for now, I'll just show you it. So this is a saw wave. Sorry, this is a sine wave because I haven't switched it back to a saw wave yet. So this is a saw wave being RM modulated by a saw wave. It's pretty low pitched because I've got this on C. In fact, that doesn't sound too great. But now, what if I mess with the fine pitch so that the pitch of this is just a little bit lower than the pitch of the carrier? Now that's pretty cool, huh? So basically, actually I think I can explain what's going on here. So if these are both the same pitch, that means that when one starts oscillating, as long as the other one starts at the same time, they will always finish oscillating at the same time. And obviously as long as you're holding a note, they will only start oscillating again once they've finished, so basically they'll be in perfect sync. But that's actually kind of a bad thing. Usually it's a good thing for pitch to do that, but it means that this, in fact, again, probably best we get out paint again for this. Let's take our beautiful saw waves. So if we have, oh, I don't want a blue, I want black. So this is our carrier, and our modulator is exactly the same. So it wouldn't really have much of an effect on each other, because essentially what it's doing is every single time it can, it's like, okay, so the carrier's at this point, the modulator's at this point, I should affect the carrier by this much. I'm keeping it a little bit vague because it doesn't really matter, because this can apply to other forms of synthesis too, but it's just most pronounced in RM synthesis. But you can do this in FM too. So basically what would be going on here is every single time, as long as you're holding the note, this part will always correspond to this part of that wave, this part of this wave will always correspond to that part of that wave. It will never change, because every time they oscillate, they'll always start again at the same point. However, if this is a slight bit lower pitch, this is what happens. And that's not just my bad drawing, that's done on purpose. So, thingy, as you can tell, the top of this spike no longer aligns with the top of this spike. Now, this part matches up with this part, whereas the first time it oscillated, this part matched up with this part. Essentially what that means is what part of the wave you're modulating can change every single time that it oscillates. Because the pitch difference is very little, it won't change it a whole bunch, but it will have an effect, and it will add up over time. Sorry about that, I thought I'd have to stop for something, but I don't. So anyway, so yeah, so you get the point. So essentially what this means is that slowly over time, as you hold the note, which part of this wave corresponds to this wave changes, which means that you get a whole lot more variety out of the sound. So yeah. You can kind of see up there how it slowly moves around. So yeah, very interesting stuff that you can do with that. Anyway, enough of that. So then there is the phase offset stuff. This is just that you can have a very slow, very quick delay between when the first wave shape starts playing and the second one. What is this knob actually? Phase retrigger. Huh. I must admit, I don't really understand what phase retriggering does objectively, but I do know that it tends to make the sound a lot punchier, but sound a lot weaker after it's kind of had its initial hit. and it's probably to do with kind of reducing the amount of phase, like the delay between each different sound. I'm not 100% confident on that one, but that's just one that you probably just play around with it and get a feel for it. So anyway, then here's the interesting part: unison. Unison is an effect that you will find on basically every synth out there, except F3 times oscillator. But essentially what it is this bar here, I can have up to 16 voices, and these are all going to be copies of the sound that I just made, except they're going to be slightly different, each of them. Now, technically they don't have to be. If I turn this knob to 0, this is already at 0, and this is at 0. This is what it sounds like to have 16 of this sound, with no difference. Theoretically, no difference anyway. There might be something small I missed. But anyway, so what we can do, though, to make this interesting, is to make it that they all have a slight difference, and we can control that. Here, right here, the detune knob, we can control how much the pitch of each one is different, which you'd be surprised does sound very nice. I think at 100%, this will make it so that the pitch will go as far as a note off, and this is probably going to sound pretty bad. You can use that, it can be very interesting, but usually you don't want that. Anywhere between 50% and 100 is usually kind of a no-go unless you're doing something that's purposely kind of like that. But it's quite pleasant when you have it at the right area. There's also the stereo, unison stereo, or the stereo width or whatever, which you can turn up to 100%, and that will mean that the position of each voice in the left and right ear is like wider. I don't remember if it's random or not. I think it depends kind of what synth you have, and some of them let you choose. But essentially, it will place some voices on the left ear and some voices on the right ear, and the percentage is how far from the center they're allowed to go. I usually like to turn this up to 100 in most cases. Only case I wouldn't do that is if I am using unison phase retriggering, which we'll get to later. But we'll get to it now. So this right here is the unison phase, which I think I do know what this does, but I'll get to it in a second. Yeah, I don't think this does anything unless we click this button. Okay, I think I know what it does now. So essentially, it looks like most synthesizers don't do this, but it looks like GMS, by default, it has the phase of each of your unison voices be randomized. So again, that basically just means that all the different copies start to play at different times. And that makes a lot of sense. They actually do that automatically, because usually that's what you'd want anyway. It might sound weird, but playing all the sounds at the exact same time doesn't sound very nice unless you're going for that kind of sound quite often. So what I mean is, if I turn on unison phase retriggering, which I believe I know what this does now, I believe this aligns all the phases so that all of the voices will play the note at the same time. It will sound like this. Now, of course, you could want that effect, but, you know, it's not as multi-purpose as the other one, you could say. So yeah, this is what it would sound like if we had all 16 of those voices with only a slight pitch difference played at the same time. As well as that, I would just like to add that due to something that we'll get into later, but is a bit complex for now, I'm going to set this stereo thing to 100%. This is one of the only reasons I would say you don't want the stereo on, because I think generally it makes your sounds just sound better, but if you have unison phase retriggering, if you're doing stuff with unison phase, it can mess with that. I mean, it's similar, but as you can tell, the effect isn't quite as intense, and you might have wanted it to be intense. So if I set this to 4, and then if I have 100%, as you can tell, the effect is much weaker. If you have the stereo panning, it basically kind of halves the effectiveness of it, because of the left and right ear. Anyway, so then there's the unison phase, which I think only does something if you've got the unison retriggering on. And essentially where I think this decides is, where does the waveform start playing from? Because if you place it, because obviously by default with a saw wave it starts from the top and it moves to the bottom. But if I put this unisono at knob thing on 50%, then that means that it will start from the middle where there's no volume. And as you can tell, it didn't have quite the same impact when I first pressed the note, because all of them were starting when from a point where the sound wave doesn't really have any volume, whereas here it's at maximum volume, or there. So yeah, so turn that off. This right here just lets you move it up octaves or down octaves, and this right here just means that you can only play one note at a time while using this. I don't know why you'd want that, but you can have that. Don't know what this is about. Oh, is this just more presets? Don't know why you can click both of those. As for this, I'm not gonna lie, I don't really ever use this menu. Oh, maybe I should. This is actually kind of interesting. Maybe man, as far as I can remember, I thought this this menu was pretty dumb and it didn't really have any good use for it. But actually, this actually does look quite interesting. I'll leave it for now because I have not really used this before. But for now, you could ignore that. So anyway, now we get into the interesting stuff. We're gonna use this as our sound. We're actually gonna get back to what we had before. So here we have the filter section. Now, this cutoff point right here is essentially going to decide where the filter will cut off. I'm a genius, I know. Now, basically, what that means depends on what kind of filter you have. There are three types of filters you can have here. A low pass, a band pass, or a high pass. By default, it's low pass. Low pass is probably the most popular one. So, what it means if you have a low pass filter is the cutoff point is any frequencies higher than this point will have their volume drastically reduced to the point where they're basically not there. So yeah, so that's what it sounds like. It sounds nice. Resonance is, I would say, quite a lot more situational, but what resonance does is it reduces the volume of the sound everywhere else, but increases it around the cutoff point, like at the highest point it can before it gets cut off, or the lowest point it can if it's a high pass. Because as you can imagine, a high pass does the opposite of a band pass. It gets rid of all the frequencies below the cutoff point. And a band pass is essentially a combination of the two. A band pass preserves the frequencies around the point, but if it's not near the point, then they go away. So yeah, this resonance, if I turn it up, it can be quite interesting, but it also can sound quite annoying, which is why it's something that's pretty, you know, kind of situational. This type button just switches between the types, but I prefer to just click the lights. And this keyboard button, keyboard tracks it, which I think is actually quite a good thing. So keyboard tracking essentially means that when you press a note, the value of this will be relative to that note. So, in fact, it'd be better if I played further apart notes. You can hear that it's not a crazy difference, but when I play the higher note with the keyboard tracking on, the higher note's more audible. Essentially, what it's doing is, it's like, well, now you're playing a higher note, this cutoff point should be pushed up a bit, because otherwise we're going to be getting rid of more of the higher notes and less of the lower notes. So it means that you actually kind of have an even distribution between the different pitches of notes. It's just from that pitch, from the fundamental pitch, it gets rid of the same amount each time, which can sound quite nice. Then we get into envelope and LFO. So an envelope essentially is just, in fact, before we talk about envelope, we probably have to talk about these. But I'll talk about those in a second. So an envelope essentially means a pattern that happens as soon as you press the key to play the note. And it can affect volume, it can affect filters, it can affect frequency, it can affect a lot. Right here, as you can see, these knobs are labelled attack, decay, and amount. To talk about what attack and decay are, I may as well explain ADSR because it's half of what ADSR is. ADSR is attack, decay, sustain, release, and essentially it's a name for something that basically all synths have that shows how they gain and lose volume. whenever you press a note. So this by default has no attack, full decay, full disdain, and basically no release. I'll turn it to no release just to make it easier. And it sounds like this. That's because the sustain shows the level that the note should stay at as we hold it, which is full volume, and it's just going to full volume. It's just going to full volume instantly and staying there. But if we add some attack, it takes some time to fade in from 0 volume to full volume. Decay works by attack will go to full volume even if sustain isn't at full volume. So essentially, if I turn the sustain down to 30%, when this attack is finished, it will still reach 100%. So decay is the time it takes to move from 100% after the attack is done to whatever the sustain level is at. So that. And finally the release is the time it takes for it to go to silence after you've already let go of the note. So I'm holding it, let go. In fact, I should make it longer. Holding it, let go. So as you can see, if you have release, then you don't have to be pressing a note for it to make volume. So yeah, that's how ADSR works. So this is the attack and the decay. So essentially all this means is the fade in time and the fade out time for this effect. Now, envelope, this technically here is a volume envelope. This is essentially controlling the volume of it. But this envelope here doesn't affect volume. It can affect either the filter, the modulation, the frequency, or the LFO, which we'll get to later. And this invert thing is just what it sounds like. It's, well, invert the effect. And destination is again just a button that switches between these lights, but I prefer to just click on the lights. So with the filter, if I made this filter like this, and then I turn the amount up to full, every time this envelope starts, it's getting rid of the filter 100% because we set the amount to 100%. Now, at the moment, that's basically just like I didn't even have the filter there. So what I need to do is I need to add some attack. And then work on the decay. So yeah, then there's the modulation. This will move the modulation from 0 to 100%. That is if you've got the amount at 100%. Obviously if you put it at 50%, it can only move it up 50%. Obviously the type of modulation is just whichever one you have selected here. So let's go to RM again, and let's just change this. So just a quick reminder that, well, not a reminder because I haven't tried this pitch yet, but so this is what the sound should sound like. Okay, and now let's see how it sounds when we fade into it using the envelope. You can hear it kind of fades in and then fades out, that texture quite quickly. So yeah, then there's frequency. I don't think you're going to be using this one too much because, well, okay, that actually did sound really good. Obviously not great for notes, but like that actually caught me off guard. I thought that would sound terrible. It's actually a good amount of attack and decay for it to sound like a decent kind of laser sound. But yeah. This is the only time I really use this, is to have a sound like this. So yeah, and the LFO one, essentially, when this one is, if you put this at 100%, it will basically change how effective the LFO is. Now, before you understand what that means, I actually have to go over the LFO, so we can't do that one yet, but we will do that one eventually, don't you worry. We will come back to it once I've explained the LFO, which is what's next. So the LFO, it stands for low frequency oscillator. As I mentioned before, sound waves don't have to represent volume. You can technically, they're kind of like a graph, so you can technically make them represent anything. It's just that when you hear them coming out of a computer, that's them figuring out the volume of the sound by using those waves. So you can use them for other things, and this is basically like taking the volume of a sound wave, and instead of having it be volume, have it be the amount of the filter, the amount of the modulator, the frequency, or the level, which all I mean by level is I don't know why, but it's another name for volume that they sometimes use. So once again, this death button just switches between these. This shape thing here controls the shape of the low frequency oscillator, the modulator, basically for this, the LFO. So it can be a sine wave, a triangle wave, a saw wave, or a square wave. And then there's invert, which again, that would just invert the effect. And retriggering, which I don't know what that would mean in this context. This sync thing as well just moves between these options. As you can see as well, I forgot to mention down here, you've got 2 envelopes and 2 LFOs. These, so you can use 2 of each. Anyway, so first of all, to get this to work, we're going to have to make this sound right, we're going to have to sync it up. So if you select none, I don't even really know how that works, but it won't be in time. We want to set it to beat, and I'm going to set it to a half a beat. So this wave is going to finish every half a beat, and then we're going to have an effect. So we'll add on this filter. Oh, I know what retriggering is now, I'll get back to that later. So, if I turn this amount up now, the amount that this filter affects us is being controlled by whatever this sine wave is at. And as you can see, by changing the amount of how fast it is in terms of beats, we can make it so that, well, it's faster. So that's quite nice. And we can do the same for modulation. Frequency, although again, I don't know why you'd want this. Unless you were going to do some vibrato. That sounds alright, but unless you're going to do that, I don't really know why you'd use this. And then of course level, which I said was volume. Or at least it should be. I thought it was volume. Huh. Not sure. Anyway. Well, anyway. So from there, we can now take the LFO and we can essentially change how effective the LFO is by using this envelope over here in the LFO mode. So you'll kind of see what I mean when I do it. So keyboard tracking again, and we'll put this little filter here again. We'll go back to having this affect it. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention what this retrigger thing is. Retrigger essentially, what I think this means is, by default, if you play another note, it won't restart the LFO, you know, from the beginning. It will just keep going. So right now this is in half a beat mode. If you played a note starting from the third quarter of a beat, then it wouldn't start this saw wave from the top, it would start it from the middle, which could sound weird. You might not want that. If you don't want that, you press retrigger, and that means that it will restart from the beginning of the wave every time you press a note instead of ignoring it. You can hear the difference. Anyway, so now, man, this is actually quite a bit expected. Oh yeah, it's because I turned the sustain down. I don't know how I forgot that. Oh, is that how I got the level to work? So get the sustain down. Just a minute, sorry about this. Yeah, okay. So that's weird. So you need to have the sustain at like 1%. But yeah, anyway. Enough of me trying to figure that out. So if I send this back... Sorry, it's been a while since I used this. I probably should have tried it out a little bit again before I did this video. So that's a cool sound, but it's still a little bit sharp. So what we'll do... Yeah, hearing those notes being played over and over again, kind of restart and get the envelope, made it a bit hard to tell if that was working properly, but it is. You can hear that the amount of the amount of kind of influence the LFO is having on this filter is changing with how this envelope controls it. And if I turn it down, it has less of an effect. Wait, no, it doesn't. That's weird. It sounds like it's the same no matter what amount I could put it at, but that wasn't how it was before. Well, whatever. You get the point anyway. I actually didn't even notice this knob was here. Can you just like literally just change the volume of this? I suppose you can. Well, that's a bit weird because you can also change the volume here. And you can also change the volume here. And you can also change the volume here, but never mind. Thingy. So here you can just choose the panning, whether it's on the left or the right ear. And we have a frequency slider here, which means that every time we press a note, it will take some time to slide to that note's pitch, if it's not the same as the last note that was played, and this percentage is just the amount of time it takes. So yeah. As for these things on the side, these are all effects. I'm actually not going to talk about most of these, because most of these will be covered later. In fact, I don't think I'm going to talk about any of these except trance, because I think that's the only one here that isn't going to be covered later. Trance is just not... all this really does is it changes the volume of your sound, so... As you can see, every beat, it makes it go to 0 volume and then fade back in. Oh yeah, and to add any of these effects, you just have to click glue. As for this, I think this is just, yeah, this just changes the X and Y of those two knobs. This just, you can change it so that it syncs up differently with the beat. Like I mentioned that this does it every beat. That's actually kind of confusing because the default is on 3/4, but it's actually on this setting right now, I believe. And you can change the amount of times it does that. Yeah, you can just mess with the LFO. So yeah. And that is GMS, that is subtractive synthesis. It was actually more complicated than I thought it was going to be, because there's a lot of things in there that are a bit complex to explain. But the next part is going to be additive synthesis, and additive synthesis is where we're going to be cooking with fire. Because additive synthesis, I think once you understand additive synthesis, you will have a very good understanding of how to make good sounds. So, I'll see you in that one. Bye.